Alrighty, I think we're going to go ahead and jump in. We've got several people on. We've got some more registered. They're going to funnel in here in the next 5 minutes, but we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction, help you understand a little bit about who we are, what our why is, and what my personal why is today, and why we're hosting this webinar. So while the slide plays on the left, I just want you all to just read a little bit about our company. We're not really here to talk about our company. We're really here today to talk about how to help CEOs understand cybersecurity a little bit better so they can hold their teams accountable, hold their vendors accountable, and just get a basic level of understanding of what's going on in this crazy world that is cybersecurity. It's quickly elevated to the top 5, one of the top 5 board concerns. So if CEOs are unable to communicate downstream to their teams and their vendors, it's hard for them to help hold those folks accountable. And in reality, as CEOs, we're the ones who are accountable for our organizations, and we're the ones held to account when something does happen. So while we have a great background in history in cybersecurity, a little bit about myself and where I came from. I started my first technical startup when I was 17 years old, learning web design in high school as a part of a college course. I did that so that I could pay for college. My father is U.S. Navy, 25 years in. My mother and father both met in the Navy. So I am very much a patriot. This stuff is near and dear to my heart. After that time doing web design, I partnered up with a gentleman who's since sold an automated intelligence company. And we started our first international laptop company where we were actually white boxing laptops out of Taiwan and reselling them back to the University of Washington to pay for my degree in informatics, which is computer science, information science, and business combined. Those programs have since exploded globally, and it's one of many ways that you could pivot and get into cybersecurity. So my entire career from that day at age 17 when I fell in love with being able to create on the internet until this point today has been solely focused on helping business owners grow or protect their business. So this is near and dear to my heart. Nothing honestly upsets me more than knowing that somebody or some group can take a little bit of computer code and interrupt, disrupt, and potentially take away what we as entrepreneurs and CEOs have built over the course of an entire career. I take it personally. It makes me angry. And I want to today arm you all with some knowledge that'll help you avoid a lot of the pitfalls that you see your peers in the space dealing with. So without further ado, that's a little bit about us and the company. We're not going to dive into that today because, again, today is educational, and that's the focus. So I want to start out with a statement. The ransomware attacks of today have obviously massively escalated in both scale, complexity, and volume, meaning they're, over the last couple of years, especially 2019 and 20, there are some larger groups that have banked hundreds of millions of dollars by launching these sophisticated ransomware attacks on companies like yours and mine. What that has allowed them to do, obviously, with a boatload of money, as we all know, you can do a lot of things. Okay, so what I'm going to show you here is a animation explaining what happens in a common ransomware attack. So this is what you would see when a ransomware attack gets executed. And then we're going to break that down piece by piece. I'm going to tell you what these things mean so you can start to get some of the understanding of what's actually going on when these things hit your organization. So just sit back, this is a quick 30 seconds, and then we'll dive into it a little bit deeper here. Whoops, let's go back one. Some of you might catch a little bit of the familiarity here on the video. So this is what we all have in our head. This is the scenario that plays out across the world, right? But there are a lot of things going on in the middle of all this before this attack can actually execute. And that's what we're going to break into real quick. I promised this wasn't going to be technical, so I'm going to explain these things in layman's terms so you can understand kind of the insider workings of a ransomware attack. So time is everything, as we all know. The average ransomware executes, as you saw, in under 30 seconds. Now, that is the execution phase. So what that means is when the cyber attackers finally decide to run the play, right, or in military speak, when they're actually executing the mission, there are lots of things that have happened before that. Now, when that actual time comes, these are the things that are actually happening behind the scenes, and I'm going to walk through this real quick. So let me grab my laser pointer here and show you a few things. So this is the crucial time, right? If you can break down and disrupt the kill chain to where it can't execute, then the rest of these things don't happen. So that first 30 seconds is so crucial. Anything beyond 30 seconds, you're really just mitigating damage. So I'm going to explain what that means. Anything after 60 seconds really is the damage has already begun to occur, and the clock is really against you at that point. So just to help you understand what a few of these things mean, a beacon call is simply the attacker calling out. It's them making a phone call outside the network to the cyber attacker or to their actual server that's controlling the process, right? Lateral movement, right? We look up here at 15 seconds. That's the attack is moving to other endpoints and other places in the network. Token mitigation, that means they've taken over your passwords and they've taken over the actual token behind the password. So even if you were to change your passwords, it doesn't matter. They still own access to the organization. New accounts, that means they'll create a new user to do further damage. And to avoid going too deep technically, every 15 minutes or so, more and more damage is happening to the network. So the problem with that is most of the solutions out in the marketplace are kind of puffing their chest and saying, hey, we can get you actionable intel in between 15 and 30 minutes. Well, there's a big problem with that. It's not fast enough, simply put. So if your entire information security program is built on the back of how do we mitigate damage, how do we react to damage, as you can see, it's not a good strategy. At that point, the dollar amounts are going up, and you're really just mitigating how much money you're going to end up having to spend after this attack hits. So there are ways to prevent this from happening, and there are definitely ways to react and prevent damage from happening early on in the process. And that's what we're going to understand today. So anybody that wants to get into a deeper dive on this and understand what these things mean, I am happy to break those down for you in very simple terms and what they mean. And then you can hold your teams accountable. So let's talk about, the super basics, right? So what is reactive? What is proactive? We have to set some baseline definitions of reactive versus proactive so that we can all agree upon where those things fall into. So again, we went complex. Now we're going to drastically reduce all the complexity, take away all the marketing language, and we're just going to talk reality here. So reactive versus proactive, right? Reactive is simple. You're defending against an attack that has already happened. And in that scenario, that's after the 30-second mark, right? Proactive, it is what it sounds like, right? In a proactive environment, what you're trying to do is you're trying to identify and address those risks before the attack occurs, preventing them from happening, okay? So while it seems like that should be simple, the market unfortunately dictates that it's too complex to deal with. But in reality, it's not. Okay, it's just some simple tweaks that you need to make in order to make all this make sense. So let's get further down that road, reactive versus proactive, right? In a reactive environment, the action is taken after the attack occurs. In a proactive environment, again, we're thwarting that attack before it enters the network, okay? Whoops, go back here. Sorry about that. So again, and then in a reactive posture, you're looking at traffic that is mirrored, okay? Traffic that is mirrored, meaning all of the traffic that comes into the network, I'm looking at all of it after it's inside of the network. In a proactive You're actually analyzing that network traffic in real time as it comes into the network. That's a big difference, right? Because if you're looking at the traffic after it's entered the network to analyze it, then that bad traffic is still inside the network. That's a big problem. One of the biggest issues in today's security architecture. Okay, so that's simple in reality. In a reactive world, because you're analyzing all that traffic and going back and looking at it later, you're getting a lot of false positive alerts. What false positives do, just like in COVID testing, is they create confusion, right? They create people going and doing the wrong things to react to something that may not be real. That's a big problem in the reactive world. So we find a lot of organizations hiring people to catch up with a systems problem, right? So you've got 5, 6, 7, I've talked to organizations with 22 people in their threat analysis department that are just basically picking through a needle in a haystack every day, right? Those false positives are taking time away from them to do the things that are actually going to proactively protect the environment. So in a proactive environment, we eliminate those false positives on the front end, which frees up their time to actually react and protect your organizations. So again, simple in understanding, but complex in the way that people are doing things. And it doesn't have to be like that, okay? So it's very important that we have a baseline understanding of what reactive is versus what proactive is. So that was my hope in helping me break that down. So now let's talk about maturity, okay? So maturity assessment is defined as where is your organization currently as far as the maturity of its information security posture. And all that means is how good are your defenses, right? Most of the, and I'm going to grab my laser pointer again for you all here. Most of the organizations that we deal with that are under 1,000 employees are right around here. They're at level 3, level 3.5, okay? Most companies over 1,000 organizations are right around level 3.5, level 4. Very, very, very few are in level 5, which is a truly proactive information security posture. And I'm just going to quickly show you what each of these mean, but don't worry about the technical side of things. Okay. So I'll talk through this really briefly. As you know, the basic layer of maturity, which is layer 1, you know, that you're just basically securing the absolute basics. Okay, so that's your physical security. Okay, so that's your door locks. Okay, is the building secure? Do you have an alarm system? Asset inventory. Do you know everything that you're protecting? Do you have a list of it? Is it updated often? Device hardening, patch management, right? Don't worry about all these terms. We're not gonna go into all this in depth. Okay, just know that most organizations under 1,000 employees are right around level 3, and most employees over 1,000 around 3.5 to 4.5. Okay, so this is where we see a lot of people is they've got a SIM in place, they're doing incident management, they've got an incident response plan in place, they're doing process audit, which means they're looking at the controls inside of the company, and they're doing some security awareness training, phishing testing, and education for their end users. Unfortunately, that's not enough. It's still reactive, and that's what we're going to dive into. Okay, what we're trying to get, and this is happening all over the world, is we're trying to get people into a level 5, which is a truly proactive offensive security architecture. So what that means is remember back when we talked about how time is everything. We want to react to these things in real time. We don't want to now analyze them and then 30 minutes later come back and provide the actual changes we want to make. We want to do this in real time at speed, okay? Real time means less than a second, less than a millisecond. Okay, that's real time. Intelligence as a service. So that's taking the latest, greatest threat intelligence from all over the world and making the rest of those reactive layers stronger. Okay, ethical hacking, that's thinking like an attacker, attacking your network like an attacker, and then addressing those findings via controls. Okay, so that's what we're going to touch on today and what all of that means. So this is where we're gonna kind of slow down a little bit and explain the difference between reactive and proactive as it relates to the different solutions. So remember, I promised we'd talk about solutions confusion, and that's what we're going to touch on. So let me grab my laser pointer here again. So reactive solutions are based on what we knew yesterday. Okay, so that's definitions, that's IP addresses, that's hashes, that's all kinds of what we call indicators of compromise, because we knew it happened yesterday, so it may happen in the future. So if we see those things happening, we can block that because we know with 100% certainty, based on what we've seen, that it's that thing again. Okay, it's really that simple. So when you look at email and spam filters, they're 100% built on what we knew happened yesterday. When you're running a phishing test within your company, for example, you're running a phishing test based on a campaign that has been successful, okay? So if they're trying to scam your company, you know it's other companies been scammed, and so we're using these definitions to prevent that scam from happening to your company again. Again, it's based on what we knew happened yesterday. URL filtering, it's the same concept. You can use free tools like urlvoid.com. It'll tell you, based on what we knew yesterday and before, this URL is probably bad. Okay, so again, reacting to what we knew yesterday. Firewalls and gateways, whether that's a web application gateway, a next-gen firewall, it doesn't matter. Again, that's definitions based on what we knew yesterday. So same thing with antivirus, right? It's definitions based. We've been using it forever. The problem with these solutions is that in 100% of successful sophisticated attacks, the attackers know how to and bypass these controls with ease. So you have to understand what a whole lot of money can do for an organization. Some of you do know that are on this webinar. When you have a whole lot of money, you can do a whole lot of testing. And we have offices in Lexington and also in Florida, and I use this analogy a lot because Lexington, in particular, Lexington, Kentucky, is what's called a proof of concept restaurant or proof of concept market for restaurants. We have about just shy of 300,000 people. We have the right household income, all the factors that make up determining whether a restaurant will be successful here in Lexington. Even if they know that it ultimately won't be, if they can get 1 year of numbers, then they know they can then take that restaurant and move it to Austin, Texas, or move it to Los Angeles, or move it to Boston, right? So the cyber attackers are doing the exact same thing in two ways. First and foremost, all of the things in this reactive list, they're purchasing, they're reverse engineering, and they're figuring out how to bypass. So that's a big problem, right? Number two, they're testing these on specific industries based on specific company sizes and specific geographies in the region where places do business like us. So they might try a sophisticated attack on a group of manufacturers in Europe, right? A small handful, knowing that they're going to attack those same small handful or a much larger number of those companies across the United States. So they're leveraging a lot of these same products that we're buying and reverse engineering them so they can figure out how to bypass them. Then you get into some of the solutions, and again, let me grab my laser pointer over here, that kind of fit in both categories, right? So you've got EDR, XDR, MDR. Don't worry about all those letters. They're all essentially functioning the same way. They are, think of how antivirus used to be the old way. These are antivirus programs on steroids, if you will, that do a lot of automation and abnormal behavior analysis at the endpoint level. The problem is, if you are not continually updating those platforms without actionable threat intelligence, then they fall into the same category of being reactive. At the end of the day, if an endpoint detection and response or XDR or fill in the blank DR platform is not actively engaging in threat intelligence as a service, then that layer is reactive in nature. So it's all about the right solution within the category and asking the right questions of that vendor, which we're going to touch on towards the end here. So there's two that you'll see on both sides, and those are endpoint detection and response and SIEM. Now there's different flavors of SIEM, just like there's different flavors of endpoint detection, okay? With a SIEM, and I want to explain this because this is very important for everybody in this call to understand what a SIEM does. SIEM technology has been around for quite a while. All it is think of it as a giant collector. It collects every single piece of binary data on the network. So whether you're 1,000 employees or 50,000 employees, the more size you are, the more data there is. It collects all of that and puts it into a big funnel, okay? In that funnel, there's basically three categories. Green means good, yellow means we're not sure, but it should be okay. And red means, oh no, we need to have some really smart guys look at this. And that usually falls on the threat analyst team inside a large organization, or your vendor if you're purchasing security operations centers as a service. All that means is it's other analysts sitting at somebody else's computer looking at that needle in a haystack over and over again. Now, this is why the speed conversation is so important. I want to give you a scenario here. Let's say your organization with 1,000 employees, right? You've got roughly 1,400 devices sitting on the network. You've got databases, applications, and all of this stuff, right? You've got printers. You guys get the idea. A network is complex. It has a lot of data flowing through it. So every single day, there are over 500,000 malwares created, okay? 75% of those only use the same code signature one time. So what does that mean? It means if the code changes, then these other technologies don't necessarily know about it, right? So that's a big problem. And then every single day, that same amount of traffic that's been generated inside your network, right? Because every day is different at work. So every single day, those millions of lines of code are creating those funnels, and they're creating that category of, oh no, this is scary, we got to look at it, okay? So if we go back to that original slide and you say, I need to react in 30 seconds, well, those two equations don't add up, right? Some of the best SIEM providers are out there, and they're great technologies, and we use them ourselves, but they're not fast enough to be your first layer of protection, right? SIEM was always created as a log. And a log, what do? When you get a claim or do anything, you're going through a history of what happened to figure out what actually did happen. You cannot run a security information posture like that, because by the time you find out what's happened, it's too late because more action has been taken. So SIEM is wonderful when you integrate it with other tools, when you add IDS, IPS integration into it, which some have done. So it's very important that you understand what SIEM you're buying and what they're doing with that information, okay? Looking at just some simple stories of things that have happened recently. In numerous sophisticated attacks, the attacker has bypassed the SIEM, gone in and changed the setting inside the SIEM log that changes the size of the log to 16 megabytes, sorry. What that does is it basically prevents the SIEM from working because it can't store any data. Another example is a group last week just launched an attack that bypasses Microsoft Defender, which is an endpoint protection mechanism, just like in this category here, and goes back in and shuts itself off. So again, the attackers understand what I'm teaching you today. They understand how to reverse engineer and how to outwit and outsmart a lot of these technologies. So that's what you need to be aware of, okay? Now, security awareness training, that can potentially fall into both categories, but here's the issue. You should never rely on your users, okay? There's a lot of people out there selling, making billions of dollars selling training, right? And don't get me wrong, training is an extremely important part of the your information security posture, but you will never be able to rely on your users for protection. So just know that it is still a reactive solution, but you're making your users a little bit more proactive in your thinking. But don't put in security awareness training thinking that it's going to really prevent any major issues from happening. It'll definitely reduce the amount. And that's what all of this is about, folks. The reason that we haven't had any data breaches in so long is because we're using a multi-layered architecture, but it's so important to understand which layers are proactive, which layers are reactive, when to put them in place, and how they talk to each other. That's the je ne sais quoi that makes up a strong information security posture. So looking at the proactive side, there's this world that you'll start hearing more and more about, and it's called threat intelligence. Threat intelligence, what is it? It's relatively straightforward. It's data about the attackers and the way that they do things and the code that they use, so you can make better decisions in real time on what to stop and what to let through. You do this in real time, and you're able to feed that threat intelligence back into, say, your EDR platform or your SIEM, or you can make changes to your firewall in real time, or you can make changes to your email and spam filter. Let's go back to that example about the proof of concept. If we can, just like the attackers can, reverse engineer a process that's being done in a proof of concept market. So let's say they're doing a testing on a sophisticated attack that's going to go out against manufacturers in the US. If we can catch that in a honeypot in Singapore and reverse engineer that, and then feed that intelligence back into your existing security solutions, then guess what? 3 weeks from today, when that attack comes through, you're ready for it, okay? So that's the big issue. And we're gonna go through some questions you can ask your security teams and your vendors to make sure that they're vetting these things out. Because you can't rely on the market to tell you these things. You have to rely on your own basic understanding of cybersecurity, and then you have to lean on your people downstream. That's why we hire these folks. That's why we work with them. And honestly, most of my time is spent speaking to CISOs. It's spent speaking to directors of IT. And a lot of this stuff they're just not aware of because they too are relying on the market to help them make decisions. So remember, always trust but verify, and we'll cover that in the next part. So some other things about proactive, okay? Ethical hacking, right? You've heard about this. Most people, what happens is they'll get a penetration test once a year because they're required by law. It will collect dust. It's just like a HIPAA compliance audit, right? It'll collect dust and changes won't be made. So a penetration test every year, you might as well save the money and dust off the old one, right? What's great is when you have a penetration test done and then you have a plan in place to address those remediation issues and actually make the changes that are required. But I can assure you most people don't do that. You're better off, right, having the ability to run vulnerability scans in real time whenever you want, or run a ransomware attack simulation where you can actually see, hey, I had a penetration test, I've got these layers of reactive security in place, how do they hold up? And you can get those done through a number of vendors very easily, okay? So those are the things that we're gonna touch on next. So it's very important to understand reactive versus proactive, so you can understand what your security teams are doing with the information, what products they're purchasing, and then of course, are they holding up? Maybe you bought something and you're not sure. There's ways to check that, and that's what we're going to dive into. All right, so we're getting kind of towards the meat of the end here. What questions do I ask? How do I hold my CISO accountable? How do I help my CISO, I should say? How do I help my CISO hold his vendors accountable? How do I hold my security team accountable? What kind of things can I as a CEO ask to make sure that at least they have answers, right? You may not understand the answers, but you can bounce those off of a third party or a professional or a peer and at least know that, hey, they're on the right track, or I need to connect them with another resource. So first and foremost, how are we addressing zero-day threats? And I promise you get a plethora of answers through this process. Write them down and then seek out a professional, okay? Hey, I asked my CISO, how are we addressing zero-day threats? And this is what they come back with. Does this line up? Are we doing things right? These are all questions that you should be engaging with your teams and your vendors to hold people accountable, okay? How are we addressing threats currently inside of our network? There has not yet been a single incident response or a single proactive engagement where we're trying to protect a company from a ransomware before they get hit, where we have gone inside of their network and not seen current threats. There's a salesy saying out there, which is there are two types of companies, those that have been attacked and those that don't yet know they've been attacked. Most companies fall into the second category, and let me explain why. That actually does hold up, even though it's a very marketing-ish type thing to say. The average attacker has lived inside of a network for over 280 days. So what that means is they're doing a lot more. Remember when we showed you what happened in 30 seconds in a ransomware? That's after they've been inside the network. So that's when they're actually ready to execute. Think about it. This could be used to your advantage. If the attacker is on average inside the network for 280 days, that means it might not be too late to get in there and make some changes before the attack is actually executed. And that's where we want to focus today. So just know that, not to scare you, just to be real with you, there is a likelihood that there is still something inside your network, and you have to do the work to get it out and then build your program proactively to prevent it from coming back in. So that question is very important. How are we doing it? right? How are we addressing threats inside of our network? And can you show me some results? Always ask for proof, right? In general, how do we stop sophisticated attacks and how quickly can we do it? That's the key here. You'll see a lot of vendors proudly announcing the ability to provide back intel within 15 minutes. Some say 30 minutes. As we all know, that's too late. So make sure you find out, whether it's your internal team or your vendors, how do we stop sophisticated attacks? Because they can be stopped, right? They can be stopped. We don't have to just mitigate damage. And how quickly can we do it? Very important question. Where are we getting our intelligence from? Who's providing that intelligence, and how often are we receiving? If you're not receiving threat intelligence multiple times a day, it's not enough, okay? And then really, really important one here is, what is our incident response plan? Have we tested it against a sophisticated attack scenario recently? That is so important, okay? So again, trust but verify. All of this stuff comes down to trust but verify, okay? So this will be available for recording, and obviously you can ping me individually if you want to copy these questions, take screenshots, whatever you need. We're happy to provide all this stuff for you. Okay, so how do you do more with less? So you've asked the questions, now you got to put some stuff in action. So how do you do more with less? Well, like I keep saying, trust but verify, right? You should test your existing tools against sophisticated attacks. There are 3 different ways you can do this. You know, my wife calls me appropriately paranoid. I would recommend all 3 because they all 3 serve different purposes. A ransomware attack simulation is going to be a tool that a third-party provider, or even you in-house if you have the right talent, can use to run and see what a ransomware attack would look like on any random endpoint within the architecture. It can be done for very cheaply, and it can be done very quickly, and it's non-obtrusive, and it doesn't disrupt your network. If you haven't done this, I recommend doing this immediately. Number 2 is the old school way of doing it, but it is still the right way of doing it, which is a manual penetration test with an ethical hacker, okay? Make sure you check the resume. Make sure you get some references. Who have they done it with success, and what kind of outputs are they providing to you? If they're just telling you your problems, well, we all know we have problems, right? Why do we go to psychiatrists? Because we want to solve the problem. So make sure you're contracting with a provider that's not going to just provide you with a list of things that are wrong, but how to fix them, but then doesn't then try and say that our tool over here is the only thing that will fix all those things. That's a red flag. So always get your penetration test done by a third party different than the provider who's going to sell you the technology. As much as I'd love to do a penetration test for you and then provide some solutions, I don't believe the ethicalness of that is proper unless proof has been provided prior to the penetration test. There's nothing wrong with contracting with an existing company if you just need to get forensics done, because penetration testing and forensics are very similar, okay? A live internal vulnerability scanning tool is very important. If you can get those, if you have access to those today, make sure they're being used, and make sure you ask to see a copy of the reports. Find out what's going on, okay? If you've done at least one of those 3 things, you can move to step 2, which is replace and remove poorly performing layers. If they're not working and things are getting through, get rid of them, okay? Give the vendor an opportunity to help you understand why they're not working and what they can do to fix it. But the reality is, if you hadn't taken that step, you would have been attacked. It's time to step away from that solution if it didn't stand up to a basic tool-based architecture test. Make sure you're working with vendors who are going to engage with you, right? You want a vendor who's going to supplement your team. You want a vendor who's going to educate your team. You're going to want a vendor when something happens that they'll actually roll up their sleeves and get in there with your team as well. Definitely avoid those sell it and move on type relationships, okay? Make sure they're engaging with you throughout the process. Make them work for it, right? Reduce threat analysts headcount and improve threat intelligence as a service automation. Here's what I mean about that. Talked to one organization, they were spending about $22 million a year just in their GSOC, their Global Security Operations Center. They had, I think, 14 threat analysts trying to keep up with the logs. Remember we talked about the logs from the SIM? This is a large healthcare organization with multiple campuses. It didn't work. They still got a ransomware attack because, again, they're sifting through massive needles in a haystack to find this world's smallest needle. Okay, it didn't work. So their solution was to double that spend, right? Spend more on SIM logging and spend more on people. That, folks, is the definition of insanity. If you buy 2 products and you keep changing the brand and you still keep getting hit, well, that's insanity. If you're doing the same thing in year 1 and your answer to the problem after getting attacked is to double that spend, that's the definition of insanity. Please don't repeat bad behaviors. Please consult with someone that you trust to find out why what you're doing is not working. And again, go back to number 1, because number 1 can give you a lot of that transparency, right? And then finally, find some sort of source that can give you threat intelligence as a service back to security and IT teams. There are plenty of vendors out there that provide this at feeds, that provide this through actual physical devices and virtual machines like our firm. There are plenty of firms out there that can do this, but make sure that they're providing it to you in a form that your team can actually work with, because it doesn't help if it's a bunch of jargon to you and you don't have the in-house skills to handle it. The in-house skills are a real problem. I wish I could tell you that problem's going to be solved. I've been participating in a lot of programs and panels trying to solve the challenge that is the cybersecurity workforce. We are 500,000 people short in the United States alone. We're over 4 million short in the world. That problem's not going away. So you have to learn how to do more with learn less. You're unfortunately going to have to lean on vendors. But if you can go through these processes and ask these questions and get more informed, you're going to be safer, you're going to sleep better, and you're going to have a better security posture as a result. This is from the latest IBM's Cost of a Data Breach report. If you haven't had an opportunity to read that, you have any interest in learning this stuff, I highly recommend IBM's annual report. It's got a plethora of great, helpful data. But I want you all to pay attention to something, because this is so important. These are all of the factors that can either help or hurt the cost of going through a data breach. Notice all the things that we touched on in this. Incident response plan testing, right? AI platform, security analytics, threat intelligence sharing, right? Board involvement, which is what we're talking about today, right? Vulnerability testing. All of these things that we touched on can improve, right, your ability to defend and obviously reduce the amount of costs associated with data breach. Now look at the things that can actually remove it or actually increase your costs, right? Let me hide this. Remote workforces, IoT devices, third-party breaches, security skills shortage, which we touched on, right? Complex security systems, right? The more vendors you add, the more reactive solutions, the less likely they are to talk to each other, work with each other, and guess what? When something happens, if you've got 12 vendors in your stack, 5 vendors in your stack, 7 vendors in your stack, if something goes wrong, it's going to be a circle of fingers pointing in the other direction. So accountability gets lost, right? So the things that we're talking about today, they're backed up, they matter, they do work. It doesn't have to be complicated. As long as you can understand the difference between reactive and proactive, that's number 1. You can trust but verify, so test your existing solutions, and then figure out where I need to inject threat intelligence to make my security stronger. That's all there is to it. So from there, I'm going to leave you guys with this. If you have questions or you want to understand what better questions to ask in the boardroom or maybe one-on-one with your CISO or with your security teams, we're happy to provide that guidance. Just know that we do stop ransomwares. It is doable if you do these things in the right order. And we all have a lot of hope out there. So stay vigilant, keep getting education, keep talking to your teams, talk to your peers, right? And let us know how we can help. So thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day.